Good evening and welcome to the School of Information Management's Information Management Lecture Series. We're very excited to welcome everyone to our session tonight. So the School of Information Management with this series really tries to reflect on the many ways that information changes our lives around us. So of course, this year in particular, with everything that's been going on with COVID, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on the profound and substantive role of libraries within our societies and our communities. So I'm very excited to welcome you all. Before we begin, I'd also like to, of course, acknowledge that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. So as you know, we're very excited to have Osa Kachan with us today, the CEO of the Halifax Public Libraries. And she's going to help us kind of unpack and reflect on what happens when a pandemic occurs in your community and things we take for granted are all shut down, and just reflecting on how that changed everything that the library does, how they communicate, and how they really support our society. So I'm going to, how we're going to work things today is I'm going to hand things over to Osa, and she'll give us her reflections for about 30 minutes, and then we're very happy to take your questions. So as she's talking, please feel free to start thinking about and working on your questions, and then we'll have lots of time to really dig in and have a great discussion. So Osa, thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks, everybody. Hi, I really appreciate you having me today. Really pleased to share some reflections. Just the process of preparing for today has been really helpful to me. Often we're so busy living what we're experiencing in a moment that we don't actually pause and say, okay, so how did this change us, or how have we been changed so far? Because of course this is still in progress. And I just want to start by saying, this is the most interesting time, I think, in my entire career to be a public librarian. I think back to when I graduated from my Master of Library and Information Science in 1993. People asked me, they said, well, you sure you want to work in public libraries? There's this thing called the internet coming up, and as soon as that's available, people really probably won't be going to their libraries anymore. They'll just go straight to the information they need. But of course, what we have discovered, and I think what has become more profound, has been that there is no institution like a public library that can create grassroots social change. So we are a democratic institution, we're accessible to all, we are free, we serve people of all ages throughout our community. And the more we know about the social determinants of health, I think the more we realize the impact the library has on the outcome for people's lives. So lots of issues: digital equality, what is the impact of illiteracy on our economy? What's the impact of loneliness on people's health? What's a positive impact of immigration and the financial consequences of us not having organizations like libraries to support newcomer settlement? What's the impact of food insecurity in our community? And of course, most recently, and this has become very true during COVID, the critical importance of accurate health information to reduce the risk of this pandemic that is spreading through our community. So I would argue that our purpose has never been as strong as it has been now, and our communities have never needed us as much. And certainly, over the last 6 months, the vulnerabilities in our community have become more apparent to us. So many people used a phrase early on in COVID that said, we're all in this together. And while we may all be at risk of COVID, that risk is not the same for all, depending on living circumstances, depending on financial resources, depending on life circumstances, and poverty, and the impact on people is very different. And I think our need for a public library to try to level that is really important. So I don't have any slides for my presentation. I'm going to, as Sandra said, I'm going to take 30 minutes to share my reflections, to think back to some of the things that happened and how we responded to those. And then we will have time for questions. And, we've all been in hundreds, if not thousands, of Zoom calls, FaceTime, Skype meetings, Teams meetings over the past 6 months. And chances are you're tired of them like I am. So I'm really glad you're here. And I really wish we were in a room together. We could enjoy some coffee, maybe a glass of wine, some food. I want this to be more of a conversation, less of a lecture. So if you have coffee within reach, just put your feet up and listen and think about your own perspectives and your own questions, and pretend we're maybe in a library together. So I'm going to organize my comments around a few themes. The first one is really what we can't ignore within our community. Then I'm going to speak a little bit to how we've needed to change how we work, the value of our employees, the value of strong partnerships, the value of good governance and leadership. And then what I will end with is sort of sharing some moments of sorrow and joy over this period, because there have been both. So let's start with a little bit of what we can't ignore within our community. This to me was really, really the piece I struggled the most with. So over the years, and I sit on the board of the United Way, and I give a lot of thought to poverty and vulnerability within our community. There have become so many things that have become clear to me in this role, and we see a lot at the public library. Food insecurity is high. There's poor internet access. When organizations and governments are sharing information through the internet, they do that on the presumption that 2 official languages will serve everybody, and that it's no problem. People can just download that form or complete that form. And we know that digital literacy is a big issue, and we know that equitable access to broadband is a big issue. And I can come back for another entire lecture on that. We know that people who are poor and who live in poverty are at particular risk in our community. And we knew, of course, with COVID that they would be at a greater risk of contracting COVID. We knew people who were incarcerated were at greater risk. We also know that there are people, particularly women and children in our community, who live in unsafe circumstances. So the concept of stay the blazes home is not always a safe option. So once you know those things, I think of that as unignorable. So I can't know that and disregard that. I wake up in the morning, and I did this before the pandemic, thinking, okay, I'm going to get out there because there are things I want to change in my community. And of course, when you layer a pandemic and the closure of our locations, very, very, the need is still there, but our ability to respond has to change. So I want to talk a little bit about how COVID has really changed how we work. So those of you who are librarians or on your way to become librarians, I just want to say we are a profession that likes things in order. So we think about information. We love, part of being able to find it is about structuring it in such a way that it's tidy and it's neat. And this desire for good order, which is a positive thing, also can sometimes make it so that we want everything to be perfect before we deploy. So I will say the pandemic forced us firmly out of those patterns. There will be in a pandemic the need for organizations that can be agile and that can respond rapidly. And we realized pretty immediately that we needed to be that kind of an organization. There have been some interesting articles talking about public libraries, and they talk about us in the context of being second responders. So we're not the firefighters, the police, and the EHS, but we are one of those organizations that is uniquely poised to respond to the underlying issues. So we're not pigeonholed in a single kind of role, but our role is about lifting up the community. So to do that in a time of COVID, we needed to be more experimental. We needed to be more comfortable in adjusting to rapid change. And we needed to be okay with the rules changing while we were moving through this. So one really good example of that is early on, we talked to our staff and said, you could wear a face shield or you can wear a face mask. Both appear to provide protection and, really do what you're most comfortable with. And I remember the moment of listening to Robert Strang, then a few weeks later, make a comment on one of his updates, says, I don't know why people are wearing face shields. They don't do the job of a face mask. Okay, here we go. We got to back up. We've got to change, get out the new content, change what we're doing, not tomorrow, today. In this experience, some things moved more slowly and some moved more quickly than we had anticipated. So if I back up to the beginning of COVID, I left on a family vacation on March 7th. We'd been monitoring this pandemic that was happening far away from us, felt really confident that I could be away for a week and come back. And in the course of the week that I was away from abroad, I shut down all of our libraries and was not sure if my plane would leave the ground to get me back home in order for me to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. That is how quickly this moved from something away from us to something that intensely affected everything that we did. The same was true, this pandemic wasn't going to wait till we were ready. So even when it came time to reopen, we anticipated that we would reopen. We launched some curbside pickup before we unlocked the doors of our branches. And in fact, the change from one to the next happened much faster than we anticipated, and we needed to be ready to respond, because the minute the public order was lifted and we could allow some people into our spaces again, the public was wanting to be back. So I want to talk about some of the practical changes that we made in responding to the community that still sort of make my heart sing, because they were a real test to our ability to sort of get comfortable being uncomfortable and move things forward. So within days of the pandemic, we had been working on a process to allow people to register for online library cards. We had sort of the interface done. We hadn't quite deployed it, and the team went from in development to deployment in 2 days. And within 3 weeks, we had 4,200 people sign up for library cards who'd never had them. We found this whole market of people who all of a sudden found themselves at home and discovered their library. So that was amazing. Within 2 weeks of closing, we rolled out an Ask a Library phone line. So technology that distributed phones and had a phone queuing system that could reach out to people who were in their own homes. Our library staff were in their own homes, so they got in a queue from remote locations. The public called in, and it was everything from somebody who needed help to navigate 811 or a COVID symptom site, to how to download an ebook, to just somebody to talk to. So thousands and thousands of people called us. That was an amazing team effort, both the technology team and the service team. Our IT team knew how critical free Wi-Fi is for people, and public Wi-Fi. And they went into our branches and they put boosters in every corner so that Wi-Fi would spill as far as it could. So people thought maybe we should turn it off. They're like, well, if you're closed, I guess your Wi-Fi is not on. And not only did we leave it on, we really worked really hard to make it go as far into the community as possible. We expanded our e-offerings in no time. Our library board gathered, and I'll talk about governance in a little while. They gathered and quickly approved, another $250,000 to be spent. We added Press Reader, which provided access to 400 different daily papers from around the world. We bought Canopy, which gave us another $35,000. Products like Ancestry became available to people at home where they historically had needed to use those in the library. And we solved problems that weren't maybe the immediate library problems that people thought of. So access to public washrooms, particularly in the downtown area, became a tremendous health concern. People were using, green spaces between buildings as washrooms because they couldn't get into the buildings that they had relied on to use for access to washrooms. So we worked with the public safety officer, and we put washrooms on the back, portable washrooms on the back plaza. And then we thought, well, if somebody really doesn't have access to safe washroom sites, then they probably might be hungry, and we started distributing snacks, and maybe they need water, and we started distributing water. And even suddenly one day there was a heat warning, and we said, well, we can't knowingly leave people out in the heat who need to get out of the heat. So although the library was closed for library purposes, we opened up the doors to Paulo Regan Hall to provide shelter from the sun. Those are the kinds of things that we didn't have a pre-written policy on, but we needed to test our decision making against our values and trust that was absolutely the only right decision in the circumstances. We couldn't unknow that somebody was at risk of heat stroke. We knew that our communications and programming team found the most amazing ways to connect with people at home, including, online cooking, online storytelling, lots of ways that that staff actually did cooking demonstrations from their own kitchens at home. Again, you know, under other circumstances, we probably would have thought we had to do it in a studio, but what we realized was our public missed our people at the library, and the ways we could connect could be more authentic, a little less polished, but it didn't really matter under the circumstances. We also knew lots of kids relied on the library for after-school snacks. So we provided snack packs, and our children's librarians got busy making activity packs to help families stay engaged and well and learning at home. And we provided those with partner organizations in Spryfield, Sackville, Dartmouth North, North Preston, and Halifax North. We also reached out to community organizations that we knew were going to be struggling. So group homes, shelters, youth centers, we loaned out books, gaming systems, laptops, iPads. Anything we had belonged to the public, and we looked for who in our community needed those more than ever. So when I think, you know, the other thing I want to speak to is really the value of our employees, because all of the things that are that was a tremendous creative effort, and that was all of us getting used to being uncomfortable. You know, I think about COVID as being both a collective experience, something we were all in together trying to respond to, and also deeply personal ones. You know, there was no one in our organization who did not have moments of extreme worry and stress about their family, about their own health, about what our society would look like. And that, in many ways, was part of what connected us deeply through this process. Excuse me, that is not COVID, that is just a dry throat. So and it was tough. COVID almost immediately put our municipality in a position where they couldn't necessarily rely on what their tax revenue was going to be. And we had cast an operating budget for 2020-21 and assumed that was all good to go. And very quickly, the municipality came back to all of us who provide municipal services and said we needed to roll back our budgets. So we were looking at a $1.5 million cut from the municipality. We knew we were going to be losing probably another $500,000 in parking revenues and fines and room rentals. We had a $2 million gap to close in our budget, and we're an organization where 80% of expenditures are on staffing. So very quickly we needed to meet with our union to explore how do we adjust, contract our budget, not forever, but for right now, and what is the best way we can do that has the least effect on our employees. So we worked really well with our union, came to an agreement about staff who were earning less than $2,000 a month went on 16 weeks of CERB, which was essentially a replacement of salary. We kept up benefits. We kept connected to those staff, you know, and for some of them, you know, they acknowledged, you know, this actually helped simplify my circumstances for a little while. And we allowed other staff who felt that that break was what they needed in order to provide care to family members or children. That happened as well. We gave them that option, and so we had a few who took that. They're all back now, which we're really happy about. Then there was the whole business of working from home, right? How do we had a lot of work to do. We had to still get payroll done. We still had to write policies. We had to communicate with our community. We were still doing a lot of programming, purchasing of materials. And our staff were trying to do all of that from home. And you know, I have grown children, but I had moments in all of that where I thought back, I thought, what if this had been my work life when my children were 2, 4, and 7? And I can't even imagine how some of them balanced that. I have such respect for our staff. As an employer, it was really important that we gave people time to adjust. Some of them worked really odd hours to accommodate children or sharing, you know, parenting responsibilities. Employees always say they want more communication, and I would say in this period, we communicated more than we ever had before. Sometimes it was just an expression of thanks. Sometimes it was some assurance that we had their back. Sometimes it was recommending mental health services. We needed to continue to support our staff, understanding they were experiencing stress in their lives beyond anything they ever had. And then we looked at, well, what are the things we used to say we didn't have enough time to do that we might be able to do? So we renovated a few of our branches while they were empty. We got some repairs done. We did repainting at Central Library. We scrubbed floors. We did projects that, you know, it's rare in a public library that you don't have people in the library. So we took advantage of that. We did training opportunities. We had 56 live webinars, 4,600 hours of learning. One of my colleagues said to me, the best thing to do when the world is collapsing is invest in your people. I thought that was a good one. We also looked at building teams across locations. We had great teams that worked in locations. How could we build teams to provide different kinds of service? You know, my colleague Sarah said the less writing we have in the way, the faster we can move. I think it's really true. We learned how to free ourselves a bit from the rules and to go back to our strategy and say, is this really on target? Is this what we're trying to be and achieve? And if the answer is yes, then we move forward. We can make good, efficient decisions and we can defend them. I want to talk a little bit about the value of strong community partnerships because they're always important, but they're particularly important during a pandemic. For us to know what our community needed relied on us being able to sort of scrape past the surface of statistics and observations from where we sit. So, you know, we work with a lot of food providers. They were helping us see the gaps. We work closely with public health. They then turned to us because they had an existing relationship to say, how do we connect with this community to share health information that's really critical? And is there, you know the people in this neighborhood, help us figure out how to reach them. You know, the close work we've done with the John Howard Society made us a natural partner when they were moving people out from overcrowded prisons into the community to help set them up to have good living environments for people when they came out. Of course, one of the biggest worries we had when the library closed in March was we offer free tax clinics for people. And Revenue Canada, some of you will recall, quickly allowed an extension of the tax filing deadline. But for this community, that's not actually what matters. It's the tax return that matters. It's if they don't get that their taxes filed, they won't get the child tax benefit and the GST rebates into the coming year, and they are so reliant on that income on a schedule that it caused a tremendous panic for them. You know, our staff did not give up trying to solve this. Eventually, we were able to do virtual tax clinics. We worked with partner organizations. One of our local members of parliament became a champion for us on this. You know, but those relationships, having those relationships allowed us to move through some of the most difficult things. I want to talk a little briefly about governance as well. So I would say governance is really an important thing for any organization. It's really important for a public library. And if you need to know your governance when you're walking into a little bit of a crisis. So what's the responsibility of management? What's the responsibility of the board? You know, is there a high level of trust between management and the board so that when I come to the board and say, you know, can we mobilize these resources to support what we foresee will be a demand for ebooks, the board trusts the judgment of the professionals in the organization and our estimation of what demand will be, and they are ready to respond because they understand their role and our role. In our case, we intersect with both municipal and provincial government, so we're funded by both levels of government, about 80% municipal, 15% provincial. We operate under the legislative authority of the province, and we occupy municipal buildings, and so it is about the accountability. To whom do you need to be accountable? But then what authority do you have? Because you can't be questioning the authority you have, or you just won't do what needs to be done under the circumstances. So that meant a lot of connection municipally, provincially. I'll speak a little bit down the road about why my national connections were so important as well. So I just can't say enough about my board, my library board, and their support and their sound judgment and their respect for the work of the library made this work well, right? It allowed a strong level of communication and a clarity around who makes which types of decisions. I was able to convene a great team of leaders inside my organization. So to have the communications team and the IT team and the collections team and delivery and finance and facilities and HR in the room together as we were moving forward, really helpful. I was invited municipally to sit on the Halifax Regional Municipality COVID-19 team, that was so valuable. There were so many times that police would notice a vulnerability in the community and I could put my hand up and say, we can help with that. We can solve that problem. Or I might know through a colleague that in fact some municipal buildings were being turned into shelters for people coming out of incarceration. That could prompt the call to John Howard Society that could allow us to fill a role. I developed so much respect for people across different roles in the municipality, and I think they came away with a stronger understanding of me. So that's important. And if you're not at the table, you miss those opportunities to respond. I would say working within the library sector with the province was important as well. Dr. Strang was really available to us. He worked with our sector, and that's important because we're trying to interpret legislation, understand changing health guidelines. We want some assistance with risk assessment. And, you know, often libraries as a unique entity weren't listed within the legislation, but it was important to understand that we fit into legislation for public spaces. In some cases, you know, we also fit into legislation for establishments that serve food. We are in some ways a business, we're a leaser of space. Provincial library checked it off, and that was an important provincial connection. And I would say nationally, I had a really excellent experience. You know, within days, every one of us who runs a library in this country realized that we had so many questions we needed to answer and policies that we needed to write, everything from safe workplace practices to how long do materials need to be quarantined? How does the virus spread on a library book? How do we create safe work from home practices? You know, how do we best communicate, whether that's how to use our buildings safely or how to use our services? You know, how do we need to reorganize our built environment and think about how people move through the library? How do we mitigate risk? How do we support rapid decision making? What does this new role look like for the library and the community? Those were all things I was grappling with in Halifax, but so too was my colleague in Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary and Toronto. So we needed to figure out how to build the right internal policies and then also be really thoughtful about what external policies are we going to delete or remove because they just have no place anymore. Our community needs us and they need continued access. So none of us had the internal resources alone to do this, but together we pooled 50 colleagues from 22 libraries coast to coast, and we stepped up, and in a matter of weeks we created a toolkit that we all now use. And it's been an amazing process to go through. And of course, those relationships that you built, they stay forever. I think the thing we came away with was that our purpose remained very, very strong. And so, you know, that was good. We needed those moments to remember. You know, I'll quickly share some moments of sorrow and some moments of joy, and then I'd love to hear your questions and you know, delve more deeply into some of the things I've said if you want to hear more. I want to start with the moments of sorrow. So this is a variation on something I did with my kids when they were in school, when they were kids. I found if they came home and we sat at the dinner table and I would say, tell me about school today, I'd get, no, it was okay. I wouldn't necessarily get much. But if we played a game called high point, low point, and so the low point would be, you know, the worst moment of your day and the high point would be the best, and it would often start the conversation. So my version of that for this is moments of sorrow and moments of joy. So I'll start with the moments of sorrow, and in some cases it's probably because they precede the moments of joy. And I think, you know, the first moment of sorrow for us was the heartbreak of closing the libraries, closing our buildings. So after years of finding ways for people to gather, to get close, to share food, to raise their voices in laughter and song, it abruptly stopped. And you know, all of those things that we had done for years to make our community safer and more cohesive and more connected could kill people. That was tough to take. And then layered on top of that was what would happen to our most vulnerable, many of whom spend their days with us. So, and what about the people for whom the library is a safe escape? And I've had so many people share their library stories to me, and it might be an LGBTQ teen where the library is the only place they feel like they can be themselves. They don't fit in at school. Home is tough. People living with domestic violence, you know, that idea of a safe place to go, a place to belong, we couldn't be that in the way that we had been. So that was a big loss. I think the budget cuts that required us to furlough our staff, that was really heartbreaking. And I understood the financial strain, it was just really tough to say, on top of all of these other ways we're all feeling vulnerable, here's one more piece to it. I think I was so sad to see people in our community dying of COVID, and particularly the African Nova Scotian community around our North Branch. They lost many of the grandmothers and many of the leaders of that community to COVID. So that's just where you see the sorrow and the fear reverberating in a community. And I would say there were personal moments for all of us, including my leadership team, all the staff. When we grieved the loss of simplicity, we worried about the safety of our parents and our spouses and the children in our community and our future as a society. Every organization is made up of individuals, and there is that collective journey that we're all moving together in unison, and yet within that are these individual journeys. So there were days when some of the most stalwart people I work with were holding back tears, and they couldn't name why. It just felt like a day of loss. So that was profound to us. And then of course there were all these moments of joy. So more people discovered their public library. They signed up for cards. They discovered online resources that they'd never discovered. The library love, there was so much expression of love. Every time one of our staff members would post something, there'd be all these comments online. Our online activity, people were clamoring for content and connection with us, and there was a lot of love from our community. So there wasn't a question about whether we were relevant anymore. It just meant we had to continue to find a way to be relevant. And I would say the richer relationships, so the team building internally, it's like we've been in the trenches together in a more intense way. The colleagues I have across the country, my colleagues here have across the country, the networks that have come, being able to be at the HRM table meant a lot to me, and it meant I know people better than I did before. And then removing fines forever. This is a real joy. Some of you may have followed this in the news. We initially said, well, with COVID, we're not going to charge fines. We don't want to handle cash. We don't want to reduce small face-to-face interactions, and we know people are under stress. And very quickly, and the staff and the library board, almost without blinking, said, we're never going to put those back. Right? We can't unsee what we know in terms of the vulnerability of our community. So I'm really happy about that. And then I guess my final moment of joy, and there will be many more to come, was really when we opened our doors again and our public came back, and the sight of their library people meant the world to them. So, I looked around Central Library today, which is where I'm based right now, and there are faces I hadn't seen for months who are familiar to me and are back, and there are students who've just found that we're their new anchor point because they're not in classes, but this gives them a community. I'm feeling optimistic. I think our world is different, and there are limitations on what we can do, but there are lots of ways that we can continue to fulfill the purpose that we've been given in our community. So, okay, 6:06. That wasn't bad. I think I was maybe 2 minutes over, which, for those of you who know me, that is nothing short of miraculous. I have a thing with words, wouldn't you say, Sandra? I like
absolutely, Osana. As someone who's very similar to you in temperament, I can understand it. I often have to have someone watching me closely. So it is just listening, and of course, I can reflect on what we had to do, as an academic institution, and it was the same sort of thing. The first weekend of March, I had the open data. I hosted the open data competition here. And I remember Mike Smith, if he's on the line, saying to me, oh, you might want to remind people to wash their hands. And I think I even forgot to do that in amongst everything I was doing. So within a week, everything was shut down. And, just that flicking of the switch like that, it just really makes you, rethink things. And, before I turn it over to other people, I always have to ask questions first. And I know one of the things as an executive, we've sort of been thinking about right now is we had to make a lot of decisions very quickly. And we didn't, of course, have full information. So we did not know how long things were going to last or anything like that. So if you reflect back to those early decisions you made, played. Are there things that you would have done differently if you had have known how this was going to play out, or?
Well, I wouldn't have bought all those face shields.
That's a great example of, you know, we were given information in bits and pieces. So
yeah, and in fairness, the science was changing. You know, somebody likened it to building a plane while you're already flying it. So, you know, this is, I use that as an example, not at all to criticize Dr. Strang or what he and his colleagues have been doing with the sort of evolving knowledge on COVID. But I would say, I think we underestimated how quickly we would need to open our doors. I think that was true. I think we also, it's a combination of things. Like, I look at where we are now, and I think if we could have predicted this, might we have made some different decisions. So, for example, you know, when we cleared furniture away, we put it into our meeting rooms because we needed to quickly get it off the floor. We needed to create pathways. We needed to space out tables. And that was sort of a very, like, let's get it out of the way. Let's open up these spaces. But of course, if you can't also allow people to use those rooms, like, you've kind of taken away your own footprint instead of, so now we're clearing out the meeting rooms and setting up tables, and that's how we're handling the volume of people. So I think that's a piece that I might have changed. I know early on in our conversations, we started even thinking about, should we only open part of our buildings? You know, you go through this exercise of saying, well, you know, what's the balance between us monitoring public behavior? So what is our responsibility to make sure we stop people from being within 2 meters of one another? And then at what point do we inform people and allow the public to, in some ways, to police one another, right? So I think that was a really interesting challenge for us in the early days to understand, you know, what was our role relative to the public's role? Because historically, we've always sort of said, public, come in and use this, and we trust you to borrow, and we trust you're going to return. And so we've had this foundation of trust with our public. And then you throw a pandemic into the mix and you start thinking, like, well, should we have staff patrolling, or is it enough for us to provide information, greet somebody at the door, make sure they have a mask, make sure they sanitize their hands? And so I think we landed in the right place, but before we even opened to the public, I think some of our earlier internal iterations had been too much on trying to control things just because we were afraid. I think everybody was afraid, right? So that's been interesting to me. What I like, and it reminds me of what I love about Nova Scotians, is we do have an overwhelming sense of collective care. So we have identified, you know, we are careful. I think we're very compliant on masks. One of my moments of joy that I didn't share earlier that I do want to share, which I took as a sort of real win for libraries, was when Robert Strang reached out to the public libraries and said, okay, so we've got this mask ordinance, we've got to get masks to people. Like, we understand not everybody can go out and buy masks. Could you possibly distribute them through the public library? And I remember this moment where I thought my heart was going to burst out of my chest, because I thought we have been trying for years to make the government see us as not just a book distribution system, but as community spaces, great ways to educate and inform and connect with our local communities across this whole province. So within a week, we had 130,000 masks that we were handing out to make sure we could keep our community safe. And that was actually one of those joyous moments where I thought, they are seeing us as I want them to see us, right? Not in the narrow view, but in terms of this great vehicle of connecting with community.
That's, you know, and that's one of the great moments that hopefully will kind of usher in a new connection for the library in that. So we have a question here from the audience. I know that HPL provides a lot of support to the community, including having a social worker on staff. It sounds like you really focused on providing support during the pandemic as well. Do you have any suggestions for us as future practitioners in providing service to all of our community members while also avoiding burnout or feeling like that we need to act both as a librarian and a social worker?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because that certainly was something we all felt at different times in this process. When the problems that you can't unsee feel overwhelming, it's really tough to feel like you have, how am I going to find the personal resources, concurrent with worrying about aging parents, and trying to figure out what groceries I need for a full week now that I can only go once a week. There are all these sort of practical, sort of personal things that people are dealing with in addition to doing their job. So I would say, if I pick up on that second responder concept, right, that we are neither the first responders, but we do become this place that is by virtue of being a democratic, accessible to all space, we do become the place where a lot of those challenges that people face, we're a person they could turn to. And I would say, I would say one of two things. I would say really do that personal assessment first about whether public librarianship, if that lifts you up and gives you a sense of purpose, or does that wear you out? And I think we all have temperaments and we all have different ways we add value to our community, but I would say that's that first personal question to ask as a future practitioner. And there are still roles within the library that are less frontline, but I think if you seek to work at a frontline capacity at a public library, I think coming with a realistic expectation is the first thing you can do. I think the second thing is, again, we arm ourselves with knowledge. And so sometimes that sense of I can't do anything goes away when you have some tools in your toolbox, or you know who to connect to, and you can begin that process of supporting somebody and connecting them with who they need. So it's an energy, it's a training issue, and then it's really building those close relationships with your colleagues so that you're kind of in it together. That it is not, it's less solitary and less lonely if there are two of you watching out for community members and caring for somebody who might be at particular risk. It's tough though. It can be really heavy sometimes, and but that's also in many respects, the most meaningful moments. So go through, I think, that first exercise of saying, is this really what buoys me and gives me purpose or not?
Excellent. And just for the audience, I'll let you know that I'm publishing the questions, and then as people click on them, I'm going to use that to help prioritize things. So the next question I wanted to ask is, have you thought about tasks or services that you will never go back to? So obviously the fines is one, that's great. But there are other things now that, it's helped you kind of see things in a new light.
Well, I hope we do not go back to sort of a cumbersome and over-bureaucratized way of working. I think one of the things that...
Sorry, as someone who works in a university.
But, yes, that's true of universities too. I think sometimes we become so formal that the energy we put into something that is just, that in managing something small is really problematic. So, if we believe that the library belongs to people, how do we support their independence, and how do we remove those barriers, not just temporarily because we don't want to handle cash, but how do we really ask the sensible questions and remove them? So, one of the other things we did was we changed photocopying. We had really complex photocopiers that required people to almost every time get our help to use them. And we actually decided it actually made a lot more sense to just load $5 worth of free copying on everybody's library card and let them go at it themselves, right? That was better for their health in COVID. We're never going to go back to making that more complicated. I think, what we consider to be basic services, basic rights, we're never going to turn off that Wi-Fi that's spilling as far as we can make it spill. Maybe when those boosters get stronger, we'll spill even further. I also think, it's hard to say, some of the moments of joy when the big sing would come to Halifax Central Library and everybody would sing in harmony, and, I don't know when that's going to happen. There are going to be certain things that are going to be on hold for a while, but I do hope we continue to get comfortable being uncomfortable and just make decisions. It's so important to have a strategic plan and to have values that are shared and well understood within the organization. And honestly, if you have that solid moral core almost as an organization, then people largely land at the right decision without actually needing to refer to binders full of details in reaching that. And I think that's a real lesson in all of this for us, and imagine what we could do if we weren't spending the time like constructing the binders worth of details. Like, imagine the good we could do in our community. So it's that invitation to say, spend our time on the things that matter.
And related to this, also thinking about there's a lot of adjustment for people involved in delivering the services, both new and the resumed services. So how has this been, for you, sort of managing change and managing workloads for all the librarians and staff?
Yeah, well, that's part of what we're figuring out, because in fact, if we look back to how somebody's day may have been broken up, 8 months ago, they would probably have had time allocated to plan for programs that were going to be delivered that day, and to, they might have been supporting the registration of people into programs. They might have been liaising with program partners. A lot of that inside programming isn't happening the way that it was. So much of our energy is being sort of directed in other ways, connecting with the community, connecting out in the community. It's different kind of work. So we are all adjusting to that. And the tricky thing is, I think we initially approached it as, until things go back to normal. And I think what's clear is that this is all shifting, right? Whatever that normal is, which would require a vaccine and sort of broad vaccinations around the world, that's a few years off at earliest. And so right now we're needing to say, okay, but who are the community members maybe that need us the most? So it is looking at, how do we connect with partners around lending out technology in a more intensive way than we did? That's a different kind of work. We have some major branch renovations. This might be a good time to make those changes and to connect with communities around those branches. Our daily lives are changing. I would say, everybody has little moments of sorrow around change. There's always a loss that comes with change. But I'm buoyed by the optimism of a lot of the people I work with, and we are finding ways to connect. I talked to two customers today, and one of them, I remember seeing him come in on the first day. He comes every day to Central Library, and he missed us and we missed him during the gap, but he was so buoyant about being able to come back and told me about all the newspapers he reads that help give him a solid worldview. I think he's approaching 90. It's amazing that we're this anchor point in his life. And I talked to another one of our customers today who was just exalting, the amazing capabilities of our staff to adapt to everything that's going on. So, there's still a lot of joy, even though there's a lot we miss.
Excellent. So sort of related to that, one of our audience wanted to get a sense of who is coming back to the physical spaces. Is it all groups, or there's some people that you're not seeing returning?
Well, there are people who aren't returning. There's no question. What we've noticed is ebook. And again, it depends on what using the library means, right? I think I tend to think of that broadly. So I think of that using our online resources, attending online programming, placing books on hold. So we've seen a lot of circulation. So people are probably spending more time at home and reading more than they might have pre-COVID. The things that we definitely notice and miss are the daycares coming through, the parents and tots and the children programming. Those in person, those were those sort of lovely days where you'd hear the laughter of children around a branch, and we love that energy in the building. So those people we're not seeing in person, but the fact that we can do things online, I think we had some really, we enjoyed that, but we probably didn't think about who are the moms and tots who aren't here, probably as much as we would now. When we think about the things that are unignorable. And what's been interesting is we've heard from some parents who've said, I've got 3 kids and, I never could make it to story time because we're trying to fit it in around naps, or we have to ride the bus. And so for us, it's a really big effort, and there are lots of things that would get in the way of us being able to do that. But because it's online or because we're streaming it, all of a sudden they can participate in that. So I think there are things about in-person that that's missing, but we're trying to respond in different ways, and we're discovering, just as we did with all the people who signed up for library cards, that there were people who didn't do in person but have now discovered us in new ways. So we're happy about that. Although, I circle back to not everybody has internet access, so that's tough. But we've been popping up. We've been going into communities. We've done a lot of outdoor programming in the Preston Township. There are things our staff are freed up to do because they're not tied into their historic schedule within the branch.
Someone also is wondering, how you envision celebrating with the community when COVID is finally behind us.
Oh, we love to party at the library, in case anybody knows. I don't know if anybody was at Central Library when we opened, but that was a 15,000 person celebration. So yeah, that'll be glorious. I'd love to sing and dance, and I think the human connection is part of what we have all missed so much. I have one of my kids is in Montreal, and she said, of course, which has high COVID counts at the moment, and her comment to me this week was, "Mom, you don't understand. It's been so long since I've hugged somebody." And I thought to myself, she's right. Like that those kids who come running to hug the storytime person, there are people we know in the library for whom we are that anchor in their lives, and doing that from a distance is tough, right? We're doing our very best at it, but I suspect there'll be a lot of hugs, some tears. I don't know if it's going to come that quickly, though. Yeah, and it'll be interesting. Have me back in a couple of years, and I'll say, well, in the meantime, we got busy doing these things, and when we were freed from some of our historic, constraints, and kind of like where we're at now. I suspect we will find ourselves doing more outdoor programming. So we did a bit of that over the summer, but the idea of knowing that outdoor space is safer than indoor space, that's a real invitation to us. We've built outdoor libraries at a couple of our locations. Where are other locations where we can do more things outside? So we may never go back to exactly how we were. Hope to bring in more song, though. So I'm missing the singing and the dancing, and there are some things that I do miss, and that will probably come back, but it'll be interesting. I do think, even just doing this lecture has given me that moment where you sort of pause and record. And I remember the National Librarian saying to me early on, we've got to find a way for people to record their journey through this, right? We often look back into archival material and we want to hear the stories of people who were in the war or people who lived through the Depression. And this is a profound social impact. And so, if any of your students can even just journal for a little while, because you're going to find it fascinating when you go back to it. And that's an important piece, because we will be different, but it doesn't have to be all bad. I think the fact that I hear people in our community talking about poverty, about vulnerability, about housing, about Black Lives Matter, there are many, many things that this pandemic has required us to confront in a way that we could maybe ignore as a community. So that we can't go back to ignoring that. That's going to, I hope, be the lasting change.
Another interesting question. Someone had sort of asked, they said they were fascinated to hear that after closure, once the locations became less relevant to service delivery, there was a stronger drive to work across branches on shared service initiatives. Do you think there'll be a return to the same level of location-focused activities, or will this cross-branch work in teams survive sort of the back to normal full reopening?
That's a good question. I've heard many of the staff say they really love being part of those kinds of teams. Our board gives awards out every year, and one of the awards for staff innovation went to the team of staff who worked on the Ask the Library phone line. And those individuals came from different locations, and they were tight together on that project. So I suspect, just like my national relationships are stronger, I suspect their collegial relationships are stronger. I think we'd like to find ways to do that. It's just that idea of infusing different perspectives into the problem that we're trying to solve. We have some changes going on in terms of the structure of the library, where we're operating now in districts rather than branches. So I think we're already moving to a more collaborative model. So we have, for example, a grouping of branches in the Western District. So the Kachan Goodman folks will know the Captain William Spry folks better, will know Tantallon, will know Hubbard. So the idea that there will be some shared management structure and some shared responsibility, particularly in connecting with communities within that district. I hope we moved that also helps to foster a more collaborative model. I think that it's so interesting to me, and what individuals who work across branches have said is they've said, I couldn't believe how many Kachan Goodman people I also see at Spryfield. So you realize, like, people are not purely local, that there are some needs that are trying to be met across branches. So I'm really hopeful that that will continue. I think for the staff members who engaged in that, they really enjoyed it, and it's hard to build a cohesive organization when people are stretched across 14 locations. Although even switching to Zoom, like we've done a lot of Zoom town halls with our staff, and those, if we did an in-person town hall, our staff from Sheet Harbor, that's 3 hours of driving for them to find their way to attend a town hall at Central Library, and that decreases the likelihood that they will come. So Zoom, in some respects, as much as we're all tired of it, it can be a great equalizer and can actually be an easier way to connect across geography than necessarily in person does.
Great. And so our final question, we've touched on this, but sort of to bring it together, one of our audience members said, thank you for sharing all of this information with us. It sounds like HPL has done some absolutely amazing work over the course of the COVID crisis. Having lived through and responded to the first wave of COVID, what would you do the same, or what would you do differently in the case of a future pandemic global crisis?
That's a really good question, because that was one of the questions. We have a COVID steering committee that used to meet, for a while was meeting every day and then met twice a week, and now is once a week, and we're wondering if we actually even need to meet right now because we're not dealing with major issues. My sense, I actually think we've learned so much in this first wave that I suspect as we look across the next 2 years that there will be times when we will have to very quickly contract service, like reduce engagement, and then we can increase engagement. I honestly think we kind of have some muscle memory on this now. I actually think what we'll discover is that will go much more smoothly, because so much of what we needed, which was how to communicate to our public, what are the things that we want to be able to turn the lever on. So if we knew, for example, that we were closing our branches, could we distribute much more technology to people to say, okay, we're going to be closed, we have to close, we're anticipating to close, but here you can borrow this Chromebook for a month. Or, we have so many things that we can do more easily into the future than we could when this came upon us in the first place. So I actually think with each wave, and as much as I hope, we seem to be doing well right now in terms of avoiding the second wave that's impacting the rest of the country, but there will come a time when we'll have more cases in Nova Scotia. So I actually think with each time we need to respond, it's not going to be quite so new, and I actually think we'll know more. I think part of the very difficult challenge in the first instance was the science was unclear. We had no experience with this virus, so we panicked. We worried about whether we should let anybody touch a book, right? Can we even circulate? This whole concept of sharing might be really bad. So my feeling is, as an organization and as a sector and as a society, we can do this better with every successive change. And many of the resources we put in place, the electronic resources that we put in place right now, they're just carrying on through. So those will already be there. We might ramp up home delivery services. We might ramp up a few other things, but I'm feeling pretty confident. it doesn't feel nearly as unfamiliar as it did in the first weeks.
Exactly. And of course, I reserve the last question for myself, as I always do. So do you have, because of course many of our students are part of this talk today. So do you have any advice for those who are, in this degree right now, especially, when you think about, because I think that's such a powerful way to think of libraries as the second responders. Mm-hmm. So, to prepare for a future in that kind of environment, what do you recommend?
Oh, there are lots of ways to learn. I think librarians know how to learn. Like, that's what we do constantly, is find information and understand it. I would say, learn as much as you can. Try to deeply understand racism in our community. Read about equity. Read about poverty. Read about people like Jan Gehl about what makes great cities. Think about everything from the geographic infrastructure in our cities, the role of libraries as anchor tenants in neighborhoods. Read all of those things across different sectors, whether it's social work or health outcomes and health promotion, or what it's like to age in an urban context, or what builds a neighborhood. Just fill yourselves full of that, because what's so interesting in the decisions we make every day is many of them are around information, but many, many more of them are around community and what makes a thriving community, which of course is a it's a complex web of influences. So have a lot of thirst for that. Read a good novel now and then too, but really sort of fill your brains with thinking about what makes a thriving community in a really holistic sense. And I think that is the perfect training. Come armed with enthusiasm and keenness and hope. Makes a big difference.
Well, thank you ever so much for this really, enlightening conversation. And I think, the one thing we're finding as an academic institution is, now that we've moved things to online, we can interact and do things in different ways as well. So, it would be great to invite you back in, a couple months' time to reflect on how things are going and how things are changing, and to continue this really important discussion. And the one thing that is different, so if we were together physically, I would present you with this lovely gift.
That's fancy.
So you will have to trust that this lovely gift will be put in the mail, delivered to you. And really, this is just, one of the things that I've been trying to say to our students is, because of course this is new for all of us. So we are all learning in this together. But there's just so many opportunities to take the time in the classroom to reflect on what's going on in society and think about what does this mean for us as a profession. So, I really, as I'm very interested in looking further into how the impact of libraries in communities is changing. And I think this is, very much, a real opportunity for us. And so I'm very interested to see how things go.
Yeah. So, no, I agree with you. I think it's great for our brains to really think about the evolution of our profession, and the role we play today is so different from it was when I graduated from library school. So it's really makes for an exciting career and an exciting possibility as a sector, for sure.
Great. Thank you very, very much. And I will just remind everyone that we, stay tuned. We will be having other public lectures. So we have another exciting one planned for this fall. So please stay tuned to us. And, we look forward to continuing this conversation in many different ways. So thank you once again, Osa. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Have a good evening.